Guys, introduce you. Bring up the stuff.
Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle, and we are once again fortunate to have with us one of the great scholars and experts on Richard Nixon, and particularly the downfall of Nixon. And of course, while this everyone's thinking about foreign policy and Nixon's mastery of foreign policy, and one can't help but think that when Nixon president today, things in Ukraine would be very different. And I'm particularly reminded of in the early 1990s when the Russian foreign minister, Andrei Kozyrev, came to visit Nixon, and he asked Nixon, what do you think Russia's foreign policy should be? And Nixon, apparently, according to Dmitry Syme, said, I find it very weird that a foreign minister of Russia would come to me, a representative of the US government, and ask me for what the foreign policy of his country should be. And I think that, again, showed Nixon's expertise and insight into Russia at the time and American foreign policy. But the immediate issue now is, of course, the downfall of Nixon, and particularly the comments of Tucker Carlson a few days ago, in which he suggested that Nixon was overthrown by the CIA. There was a CIA conspiracy to get him out, and as facts, he pointed to the Watergate burglars, most of whom had worked for the CIA. And then Tucker Carlson a few days earlier had also suggested that the CIA at the very least had a hand in the Kennedy assassination. So basically it was a whole thing. The CIA basically got rid of two presidents. So we thought of, well, who's the person to ask about this? But, you know, our friend Geoff Shepard. So Geoff, what was your take on what Tucker said?
Thank you, George. We begin with a disclaimer. I'm a specialist in domestic affairs. I was associate director of the domestic council and deputy counsel on Nixon's Watergate defense team. But I've actually visited the CIA once, but I'm not an expert on the CIA. Tucker's comments caused quite a stir. He's very prominent. I like him. I don't agree with him on everything. I don't happen to agree with what he said on the air on Watergate and on Nixon. But he's usually thoroughly prepared. He's articulate as he can be, and he's really interesting in the positions he takes. Again, I don't agree with them all. His publication, The Daily Caller, before Tucker became famous, reviewed my second book. I mean, we're friends. I think the nicest way of putting it is his researchers let him down, because there were factual inaccuracies, clear factual inaccuracies that kind of detracted from his rather wild conspiracy theories. He was channeling a program, I believe, that I haven't seen by Roger Stone 2 days before, or his researchers were. And of course, the CIA is easy to pick on because it's quite secret. But let's quickly run through what he said just to start the conversations, because again, I think there's a different conspiracy. He started talking about Nixon's landslide reelection. That was singular, but he's very careful in choosing his words, because Nixon didn't win the greatest number of electoral votes. Ron Reagan did that. He did not get the greatest percentage of the electorate. Lyndon Johnson did that in '64. He had the biggest gap between him and his other partner, between him and McGovern, which was true. But that's very carefully phrased. But regardless of how you do it, it was a landslide re-election, and 2.5 years later, he resigned from office in disgrace. And then Tucker goes into this quote from one of the Oval Office tapes. And there's a couple of difficulties with that. One, they had the wrong date. He said June 23rd, 1972, and it's true. Richard Helms and his deputy, Vern Walters, came to the West Wing on that date. But they met with Ehrlichman and Haldeman. They did not meet with Nixon. There's no tape, no such tape. And Tucker was quoting this supposed transcript that says Nixon said, "I know who shot John," meaning Jack Kennedy. I know who shot him. But that statement was made to Helms in the Oval Office on October 8th, 1971. It's just a totally different date, different context. And many believe, there are very few experts on the tapes. That's not one I did, because I did Watergate tapes. This was not there. It's Nixon is urging Helms to provide information to him about what went on in other administrations, so they can pursue these questions. Like who shot John? It's a question to be pursued. It's not a statement in the interpretation of several people whom I respect on these tapes. And then he goes on to quote Len Kolodny, who wrote Silent Coup, who just hates Bob Woodward, and Len's passed on, but he was in differences of opinion with Woodward from day one. Woodward does have a strange background that is difficult to document, but Tucker said Woodward was detailed to the White House, and I think that conveys the wrong impression. My belief is that he came over on occasion to brief people on the NSC, but he didn't work at the White House. There wasn't an office for Bob Woodward. That would be well known and well explored if that were true. And then he said the COINTELPRO program, which is the secret FBI investigation of people they don't like, targeted Nixon, which is also not the case. It targeted subversives. Woe unto you if you were labeled a subversive, but Nixon was not considered subversive. It was communists, and then civil rights agitators, and then women's libbers, all of whom had to be communist in J. Edgar Hoover's view.
Could I just jump in there, just on this COINTELPRO
COINTELPRO, yeah.
COINTELPRO. It was run by the Mark Felt. Mark Felt was Hoover's number two. Mark Felt did target Nixon, so that may have been the source of the confusion, that COINTELPRO was run by Mark Felt, and then Mark Felt targeted Nixon by his leaks to Woodward and Bernstein.
Let me come back to that just a second. I just want to finish my little list.
Okay.
And the last entry on my list is Jerry Ford's presence on the Warren Commission is perfectly defensible. There was no unknown background. It wasn't a surprise. He was head of the Republican Policy Committee, a respected Republican congressman. He was the Republican on the Warren Commission. Now, the Warren Commission is hugely criticized. But from my perspective, the major criticism is it didn't explore organized crimes involvement in the Kennedy assassination. They didn't explore Oswald's connection with the communists. They did explore that. They went great through it. But there's no question the Warren Commission is subject to challenge. Now, let's go back up the list for the fun of your viewers. One, you have to understand, in any major event, worldwide event, there are going to be factual differences that nobody can explain. Watergate, the Kennedy assassination, the grassy knoll, Oswald's shot, his ability to get off 3 shots so accurately.
It's a Bruder film.
Well, it is, but people love conspiracy theories. Yeah. Landing a man on the moon, there are people who say it didn't happen. So and we're involved. We're dealing with human beings, and memories change, and facts can't be brought into line. So now back to your point, if I could. Yes, the FBI ran COINTELPRO. Mark Felt was deputy, so he's all over it. But Mark Felt was not against Nixon. There's this wonderful book by Max Holland called Leak, Why Mark Felt Became Deep Throat. And for your listeners, Woodward and Bernstein's claim to fame as fantastic investigative reporters is they had this source, this secret source, nicknamed Deep Throat. And for 30 years after Nixon resigned, it was generally believed Deep Throat worked on his White House staff and was so disgusted at the criminality he was leaking to Woodward and Bernstein. And then it turns out it's just not true at all. He was deputy director of the FBI. He had not been named director. He was hugely disappointed. Pat Gray was acting director of the FBI, and Felt was leaking material to Woodward with the intent of showing that Pat Gray was not capable of running the FBI. So, but it's very clear. I don't know. I really am unaware of a current article or advocate from the time Felt came out in about 2005. And when he did, he's too senile to answer questions. So you just can't prove or disprove it. But I'm unaware of any article from 2005 forward that says Felt was out to get Nixon.
Nixon thought that. I mean, it's in the tapes. Nixon always thought Felt was his source of problems. I mean, he didn't say Felt is deep throat, but he did think Mark Felt is a problem for me, and that he's conspiring against me.
Now, George, with all respect, I think they felt was leaking, and that was a problem. But they were trying to confirm Pat Gray. I mean, you in the context of the tapes, and there's a series of Watergate tapes. There's March 13th, March 17th, March 21st, March 22nd. And by the by, you remember I transcribed the tapes, and I produced that volume on transcriptions called the Blue Book. There's a project underway that I'm involved in to go back and modernize those transcriptions, because they were there's better equipment, that those were produced in a hurry, and really study what was said. And I've just recently completed some very, very relevant conversations. So I think I'm really quite current on what the discussion was about Mark Felt. And in my interpretation, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying my view differs. They thought of firing Felt because he was leaking, but they thought he would just leak more if they did that. They didn't control the FBI. And just one little joke there while we're at it. Al Haig is talking to Nixon, and Felt comes up. The name Felt comes up. And Haig says, "The white rat." This is on the tape. And Nixon says, "The what?" And Haig says, "Well, that's the nickname they use behind his back at the FBI, the white rat." And Nixon says, "Why?" And he says, "Well, he's got this kind of long, sallow complexion and this odd face. And well, Mr. President, he looks like a rat." And middle of Watergate. Let me go back up, if I could, to Helms. I find this stuff fascinating, George. I mean, it
is fascinating.
It is, because you were there, and it was my introduction into politics that sure. I've never lost interest in. Okay, I mean, this is the seminal event of when I was very young. I remember this like it was yesterday.
It was mine too. Remember, I went from law school. I graduated from Harvard Law School, and 2 weeks later, I was selected to be a member of the White House staff. So amazing. 5 years, it was my first job. It was a hell of an education. And like all of us with our first job, we remember everything. Now, I wasn't in charge. I wasn't making the decisions. But it's even better than saying I had a front row seat, because I was on the stage when the decisions were made. And it enables me to do better research and to connect things. So here's the connection. Nixon leaves as vice president in January 1961, comes back as president in January 1969, gone for 8 years. And 4 major foreign policy things changed. The invasion of Cuba, which was planned as Nixon was leaving office, didn't work out well. Our ally in South Vietnam was Diem. He got assassinated and the generals took over. The Cuban Missile Crisis. We had missiles in Turkey, secret, aimed at Moscow. And somehow those got removed as part of the Great Compromise. And apparently we promised we'd never invade Cuba, which left our worldwide opponents with a foothold right next door, 90 miles off the Florida coast. And the bombing hole. If you remember, Lyndon Johnson declared there's been a major breakthrough on the war, and want everybody to come to Paris, will solve the war. And Nixon felt stabbed in the back. He thought Lyndon invented that out of thin air. So he's got Richard Helms, and he says, I want to know what happened. I want to know in these 4 things, the Bay of Pigs failure in Cuba, the assassination of Diem, what was our role? They wouldn't have done that without our permission. The withdrawal of the Cuban missiles and this bombing halt, which I don't believe. I don't believe there was a breakthrough. And Helms said, you know, the CIA services each president one at a time. And we don't tattle between administrations. We won't tell you what we did for Lyndon Johnson and what we did for Jack Kennedy, which drove Nixon nuts. He didn't believe that was fair. So he's pressing on Helms, but he's not really successful. So then you get the leak of the Pentagon Papers. You know, this is 1971, and this is the biggest foreign affairs disaster since World War II. And he appoints, I mean, well, you got to understand the Pentagon Papers study was run by the three highest ranking anti-war officials in the Department of Defense: Paul Warnke, Mort Halpern, and Les Gelb. Nobody else even knew what was going on. It wasn't peer reviewed. It wasn't shared with state. It wasn't shared with the NSC. It was a total surprise. And it bursts out of nowhere. Nixon is furious. Kissinger's furious. We got to find these guys and we got to stop this. So they set up this special investigations unit in the White House, and it's called the Plumbers because they're supposed to stop leaks. And it consisted of 2 heads: Bud Krogh, who was my immediate supervisor on the domestic council, and a guy named David Young, who was Henry Kissinger's aide-de-camp. And Bud was supposed to head up the sorting out and stopping of the leaks. And David was supposed to head up the effort to declassify. Now we're going to get into supposition because I just connected these 2 things last week because of what Tucker said. I went back and did some other stuff, some chatting. Nixon felt wronged in 4 areas, or that the United States did not conduct himself. And yet the American public believed that what Lyndon Johnson had done and what Jack Kennedy had done was all great, that they were really great presidents, and Nixon has taken all this incoming from every direction. And he wanted to declassify material relevant to those 4 issues to spread a little mud on his predecessors. That's what I think David was supposed to do, not wimpy declassification for the fun of it, but to get out for the public to understand and try to appreciate these foreign affairs decisions that put us in some trouble. Okay, now let's take a step back. Tucker says it was the CIA. Okay, I've been studying this thing since I lived through it. There are 5 prominent conspiracy theories. And with your permission, I'll just summarize them real quick, and then we can go and have fun with questions. Theory number one, it's all Nixon. It's all Nixon's fault. Perfectly clear. His campaign people tried to subvert democracy, broke the law, got caught. Too many people at the campaign and perhaps on the White House staff knew about the proposed break-in, and there was a cover-up to keep that from becoming known to the prosecutors and to the American public. So conspiracy theory number one works off three facts. There really was a break-in. They were caught red-handed. There really was a cover-up. There's no question about it. John Dean has always admitted he was desk officer for the cover-up. Desk officer is a Department of State term for the individual responsible for knowing everything about a particular country or particular issue. So if you're desk officer for Turkey, you may not make all the decisions, but everything goes through you. You have a copy of everything. You're responsible for keeping track of everything. Well, John Dean did that for the cover-up. And then Nixon really did resign. I mean, he's the only president in our history who resigned to many people confirming his guilt. To most people, yeah. Nixon's resignation confirmed that he was guilty. So that's conventional wisdom. The second conspiracy theory is put forward by Jim Hogan in his book Hidden Agenda, and that's the CIA. All CIA all the time. There's 5 Watergate burglars. Every one of them that got caught red-handed had some connection with the CIA. The 2 masterminds who weren't in the building, but we suspect were close by, Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt. Well, Howard Hunt was a career CIA officer. And Jim McCord, who was caught red-handed, was a career CIA wireman. And the Cubans had worked at various times with the CIA. One of them, whose name escapes me, actually reported to his CIA case officer about this proposed break-in. And the case officer wasn't senior enough to know what was going on. He said, no, that's not possible. You know, your rumor mill is overactive. So every person except Gordon Liddy. Now, Gordon Liddy is FBI assistant district attorney up in upstate New York, but no known connection with the CIA. The trouble is, Gordon was in charge. This was Gordon's plan. And for you to believe it had to be the CIA running everything, you'd have to believe they captured mentally Gordon Liddy and used him like a puppet. And I knew Gordon, and I worked alongside Gordon. I didn't happen to like him. I thought he was too intense. I didn't think he should be on the White House staff. I thought he was a scary guy. But nobody could claim he was stupid or he could be made into a puppet. Now, having said that, I think the CIA knew what was going on. Howard Hunt gets disguises from them to go call on Data Beard. Remember that about the ITT scandal? They go out to reconnoiter the break-in, the plumber's break-in into Daniel Ellsberg's shrink's office that occurs in 1971. And they take a picture of Gordon in Dr. Fielding's designated parking space to show they were in the building. And then they bring the camera back and have the CIA develop the film. And the charts, when Gordon first goes over to the Attorney General's office to describe this unbelievable campaign intelligence plan called Gemstone, the CIA made the charts, you know, so they know what's planned. And I think the worst you can say is they decided to let it happen. They didn't come over and say, you know, Mr. President, your top people working for you, your lawyer and the people on your campaign are planning to do something illegal. I think they thought Nixon might actually know, and they decided they should just stand clear. So they watched it happen. Now, one of the difficulties we have is when Richard Helms left as director and went to become ambassador to Iran, he burned a lot of papers. So it's not we're going to come across them, they're gone. So that's theory number 2. I don't believe it. I believe they're close. I believe they're blameworthy, but I don't believe they were running it. Number 3 is it was the military. It was the military all the time. The military was afraid because Nixon was playing footsie with our 2 mortal enemies, China and Russia, in secret with this crazy Harvard professor, Henry Kissinger, and these liberals that he had on the NSC. And Nixon was announcing troop withdrawals without pre-clearing them with the Joint Chiefs. So they set up a spy ring. And your viewers can find it. It's called the Moore-Radford affair. Moore was Admiral Moore, Navy Secretary, was chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And Yeoman Radford was this male secretary, is what it amounted to, with an office in the White House compound. And he'd befriend all of the secretaries to the high muckmucks for the NSC. And of course, at the end of the day, any documents that have kind of moved around, you put them in a burn bag and they're taken down to this mammoth shredder in the basement of the old EOB. The shredder, just because your viewers might like this, it slices each sheet of paper 64 pieces like sliced bread this way. Then it slices 64 slices horizontally, and then it mixes it into a mash of water. So you're never going to reconstruct that page. Let me assure you of this. He'd go around and say, I'm going down to the basement. I'll just take your burn bag for you. And then he'd photocopy it. And then when Kissinger or Haig were abroad, they would send him instead of one of the secretaries because he could carry the briefcases. He could carry luggage, sensitive luggage, which he would take to his room and then photocopy. So they thought he probably copied 5,000 pages of classified documents. And they caught him. It's written up in books. Len Kolodny's book, Silent Coup, it's got 2 parts, but the main part is the military was spying on the president. And then he published following that, The 40 Years' War. And then his colleague recently published Haig's Coup, C-O-U-P, coup, alleging that Haig was a part of this spy ring. Now,
it sounds like Nixon had no friends.
well, Peter, it's funny you should say. Every organization in Washington, in addition to the press, wants to know what the hell's going on inside the White House. What's he going to do? What's he going to propose? Who does he like? Who does he listen to? So we can influence what this guy's going to do. President's one guy. The executive branch is millions of people. If you count everybody, he gets, if you count everything, 9,000 appointments, but he didn't know 9,000 people. But boards and bureaus and advisory commissions, I think something like 600 are Senate confirmed. Cabinet secretaries, sub-cabinet, U.S. attorneys, ambassadors. That's about it. But when you're president, take you, Peter, what a fine guy. Look good, presentable. You get elected president, and tomorrow everybody wants to be your friend.
Yeah.
Everybody. So every president goes back to people who were friends before he was the odds-on favorite to become president. So who was with Bob Dole before Iowa? And I'm making that up, but that's a big game. And it's not unlike the royal courts of old, the palace intrigue, the backstabbing, the who does the king trust? Who's out to kill the king? What about his brother's son? Who kind of sees how this could work. Well, Nixon's in the same shape. He's been in the game a long time. He knows how the game is played, but he doesn't trust many people. Particularly
did he trust Haldeman and Ehrlichman? I mean, I always assumed that those are the two people that he did trust, Haldeman and Ehrlichman.
Well, they were, but try going further. Okay, he trusts Kissinger. He trusts Bill Rogers. He appoints him Secretary of State. Bill was Attorney General when Nixon was Vice President. There's this book called Last Man Standing by Woodward. It's really written by his secretary, as near as I can tell, about Alex Butterfield, who disclosed the taping system. And Butterfield is describing how nervous Haldeman was at the idea of introducing a new person into Nixon's immediate staff, and that he didn't want to bring him in right away. He wanted him to be around and seen and trusted, because Nixon didn't trust people easily. That's very clear.
That's me too. Okay, I understand.
Well, you'd make a good president, Peter.
But Nixon was right about Butterfield. I mean, Butterfield did screw him over. He did.
Well, he did.
So he was right.
And there's allegations Butterfield was working for the other side. Butterfield knew. He had told about the tape system, but for bizarre reasons, didn't tell the White House he'd revealed the system existed. So he told them on Friday. Al Haig didn't learn about it till Sunday night, and the president's in the hospital with pneumonia. So Haig decides not to tell Nixon. Now, they could, if they had just the least bit of warning, they could have exercised executive privilege and say Butterfield can't testify, and then they could have come up with better ideas. But they didn't. They caught red.
At that point in time, they could have destroyed the tapes.
Any from that point forward. So I discussed this stuff with Bizarre. I became his deputy. He was there, and he said he's watching the Irvin Committee hearings Monday morning on TV. Butterfield reveals the existence of the system, so he gets up. He was in the old EOB. He walks across to the West Wing, where Haig is, and says, "Is this true?" Haig says, "Yeah, when I came on, they told me there was a system." He says, "Is it still operational?" And Haig says, "Well, I assume it is. Nobody said to shut it off." And Bizarre told me, he said, "Well, Al, maybe we should disconnect it. Maybe we should stop the tapes." And
Geoff, you're finishing up, or we?
All right, I'm on four. Four's the military.
As you finish number 3, I would like to interject and just say, the Soviets buy into theory number 3 because they still believe, historians here, analysts, that Nixon was thrown out because of détente. The military didn't want to go down to 10, and they believe that Nixon was dismissed by the military elite because of his overtures to the Soviet Union and reaching out to China. That's what they think here.
Well, but that's not an irrational position. There's no question the military did not trust Nixon. I mean, there's no question about that. What was really funny, and James Rosen in his book, The Strong Man, describes this, they caught him. And there's this bracing interview on tape with Admiral Wellender, who's Yeoman Radford's boss at the White House, who's forwarding this stuff to the Pentagon, where he confesses to all this stuff. And then they're in the Oval Office with Ehrlichman, Haldeman, and Mitchell. And they say, "Boy, we're going to court-martial Moore. He's been spying on us." And Mitchell, I'm told, this is Rosen's story. Mitchell says, "Oh no, we've got him. We just have to tell him we know what he's been up to, and he's ours." Which is, it gets the Byzantine. Okay, number 4. Number 4 is the weirdest theory you will ever have heard. You will find it unbelievable, but I tell you, there are people that believe it, that Nelson Rockefeller concluded he could never win an election to be president, but wanted to be president so badly that he played the long game. And the long game was first to pass the 25th Amendment that said if you get a resignation, you can become president or vice president on confirmation of both houses of Congress. Then he euchres Nixon into naming Spiro Agnew as his vice president. Rockefeller, knowing, this is a theory, knowing Agnew was corrupt. So the corruption comes out, Agnew resigns. The only person that could be confirmed at that time was Jerry Ford. Yeah, just like Tucker said last week, Carl Albert, the Speaker of the House, said we only gave him one choice. Well, but that was true. Nixon wanted to name Connally, but they couldn't confirm Connally. Democrats were in charge. And Albert basically said, if you put up Jerry Ford, we like him, he's straight, he's got no involvement, we'll confirm him. So Ford gets confirmed. And then Ford names Rockefeller as his vice president. Nelson is number 2. And then there are 2 assassination attempts on Jerry Ford. So this guy who's going through this conspiracy theory with me, getting more and more excited, he says, you know, Ford had to dump Rockefeller in the effort in 1976 and put in Bob Dole in order to live, because it was only going to be one bullet. And honest, Pete, this is the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Gnomes of Zurich. You know, this is really, really.
No, it's an interesting story because I'll never forget Nelson Rockefeller's final demise. Okay, so I mean, he kind of this is a very, very colorful story. Okay, and he died in the most colorful way.
But it is interesting because, to be honest, I was always puzzled why did Ford name Rockefeller as number 2? Because Nelson Rockefeller was hated within the Republican Party. Ford had to have known that this is going to weaken him terribly. I mean, there was, he had the fight of his life just to win in 1976 against Ronald Reagan.
But he's loved by the Democrats. He's a Eastern liberal Republican, and that's why he's acceptable to the other side. 2 quick vignettes because this is fun. Under the 25th Amendment, you got to be confirmed by the House also, not just the Senate. So Rockefeller's up for confirmation. They're starting to disclose his family's wealth, and his family doesn't like it.
Not at all. Particularly his brother David was really upset about it.
Yeah, you bet. David was one serious guy.
Yep.
So Nelson said when they were putting him up to be confirmed, he said, one of the things that's going to come out from this is I'm not nearly as rich as people think I am, which was intriguing. But it turned out Nelson gave money to people who had been named to a federal post. Because you're named, you can't work until you're confirmed. So frequently it's 3 months, 4 months of no income. The government will not pay your move. There are no bonuses. You take a huge cut in pay. You got to pay your own money. So he'd give people money. Gave money to Kissinger, gave money to Felix Rohan, gave money to others. And the number that used to come up amongst his favorites was $25,000, which was a lot of money in those days. So one of the senators, I think, is leaning hard on him. And Nelson loses it. And Nelson is known. He does not suffer fools gladly. He says, Senator, you have to understand that my giving a man $25,000 means no more to me than you're giving him a nickel. There's this silence, because it was true. It was true. So Nelson gets off. The guy who this proponent of the Nelson Rockefeller theory points to this book. Hang on with me. 31 days. He says this confirms the whole thing. And of course I own it, but I don't study it. And it's the 31 days between Nixon's resignation and Ford's pardon of Nixon. Resigns on August 9th, pardoned on September 9th. And about August 20th is when Ford nominates Rockefeller to be his vice president. So that's the theory. You'd think maybe there's only one guy in the world that believes this theory. He's passed away. But James McCord wrote, when he was still up for the trial, that he became involved in this whole effort because of his fear of the Trilateral Commission. And you sit there and you sit there and say, you got to be kidding. Yeah. This guy was a career CIA officer. And for him to say, I don't think we were running our country. I think, this foreign group was making our decisions. So then you get to the fifth.
Before we finish, Nelson Rockefeller, I've heard all through my life that he once said, I never want to be vice president of anything. Is that a true statement, or is that just something the media made up?
I don't know. I didn't study Nelson. I came from the West Coast. Lots of people have said that. I think George Wallace said it wasn't worth a warm bucket of spit, except he didn't.
It was somebody. It was someone pre-Civil War that said that once.
But George quoted it. I mean, it was what the hell? Prince Harry writes this book called Spare. Okay, he's the second brother, and that's the vice president.
Yeah,
you really don't have anything to do.
Except for your Dick Cheney, okay?
Well, no, that's a huge difference. Spend a minute with me here. Dick's a good friend, too. George Bush II needed Dick Cheney. I mean, that was big stuff. When Nixon was vice president, he didn't have an office in the White House. His only office was the up on the Hill, where as vice president, you preside over the Senate. And he swore, by God, when he had a vice president, he'd include him more. So he gets elected president. He puts Sparrow in the West Wing, gave him an office. And then it becomes pretty clear that Sparrow and Sparrow's people aren't as deep thinkers and aren't as knowledgeable as they might be. You might have seen him as a rounding error to balance the ticket. So they kick him out of the West Wing and they put him over. Vice president's office is on the second floor as you enter the EOB from West Executive Avenue. And only from Nixon forward was the vice president around, and then included two more quickies and I'll be through. So Nelson is assigned as the newly confirmed vice president to be the head of the domestic council. I'm associate director. We have our first staff meeting with the vice president, Nelson Rockefeller, one of the richest men in America. And, I'm 6'5.5". Nelson's about 5'9". So the first thing you notice is this guy's demonstrably shorter. We're sitting at the staff table. He's got on a vested suit, and from his vest pocket, he extracts a vial of pills, saccharin or whatever the flavoring pill was. And he takes a pill out and he puts the pill in a cup of coffee, talking to us about his hopes and dreams, takes his glasses off and stirs his cup of coffee with the temple of his glasses, puts them right back on without mincing a word. I mean, I gotta tell you, stunned silence in the room. Okay, he's a normal guy. Final thing. My office is on the second floor at the opposite end of that hallway. There's the old EOB is a figure 8, and there's a bisecting hallway. And I'm at one end where the Secretary of War was, and he's at the other end where the Secretary of the Navy was, and then down to West Exec. So my wife and I are going to a governor's dinner, black tie, at some hotel. It's high muck week. And she works for the state of South Carolina. So she's in a ball gown and I'm in a tux. And we walk to the vice president's hallway where there's an elevator. And we push the button for down. And the Secret Service comes out from Nelson's office with Nelson. And they kind of hush us a little bit away so he can get on the elevator. He has rights. And he notices we've been displaced. And he says, oh, come ride with me. You know, we're safe. We're dressed up. So he falls into conversation with my wife. And at that time, my wife was quite pregnant. Well, and he says, I think we're going to the same place, you know, because she's all dressed up. He's going to a formal dinner in the White House itself. And she says, no, in her Southern accent, oh, no, Mr. Vice President, we're going to the governor's dinner and you're going to the state dinner at the White House. And he says, oh, what a disappointment, because Nelson likes pretty women, even pregnant pretty women. And she says, well, you know, you're welcome to come after your dinner. We're over at the Sheraton, you know. And she falls into step with, he falls into step with her. And they describe this in Secret Service terms. If you're within the bubble, you know, where the Secret Service cordon includes you. So she walks across West Exec, we bid adieu, we go our way. He doesn't come to the dinner. But she says to the chairman, now, I invited Nelson Rockefeller. So don't be surprised if he shows up at the door, because this was the time when Nelson was trying to make friends across party lines and all that sort of thing. So, and then just to finish it, he never wore that dress again. We call it the Nelson Rockefeller dress. You know? Yeah. And of course, it was bigger, so it's not a reason. But what a wonderful story for my wife. My fifth conspiracy theory is mine. If you get down, I've got 3 books, and if you get down to the first one, the first book says, look, Ted Kennedy and Kennedy's people were responsible for Nixon's demise. And people's reaction is he had nothing to do with Watergate. And my reaction is, if you look into everybody who responded to Watergate, who drove Nixon out, investigated him, wrote the press articles about him, all that, they're all Kennedy people. And my theory says when Jack Kennedy was elected, he brought at least 1,000 people like him to Washington. This was fun. You don't go to Wall Street. You don't work in daddy's company. You come to Washington and you play politics, and we are the beautiful people. And the press loves us, and we are in charge. Ain't life great? And then he gets taken from them illegitimately. He's assassinated. And they're left with Corn Pone Lyndon, who shouldn't have been made president. Bobby Kennedy should have been made president. He was the second most powerful person. So this group of people doesn't leave. They stay waiting for the restoration of Camelot. And Bobby's going to do it because Lyndon Johnson is now president. There's a vacancy in vice president. There's no 25th Amendment. But when he runs for election in 64, he'll name Bobby and we'll be back in line. Lyndon doesn't go along. It's, you know, he doesn't want to be assassinated too. So he names Humphrey. Bobby pouts, runs off to New York, gets elected senator, and everybody waits. And they wait. And they wait. And then 68 comes. Johnson is driven from running by Gene McCarthy. Keep clean with Gene. Bobby jumps in the race. We've got the restoration of Camelot right at our fingertips. He gets assassinated. And they're left with Teddy. Teddy's not the man his brothers were. 14-year difference between him and the older guys. And he's got this mistake. A chap quit it. So he's damaged goods. And it's not so much Teddy wants to be president as these people who've been waiting, law firms and think tanks and charities, waiting for another Kennedy so they can be back in charge. They want back into power. Now, Chris Matthews, you know, a knowledgeable commentator, political maven, he will tell you it was Teddy's people who got Nixon. And my first book goes through all the detail of where they popped up and how they got there and all this kind of stuff. And they did get Nixon, but Teddy didn't run in 76, which was astonishing to all of his people.
Why didn't he run in 76?
And do you think he could have been elected?
Well, let's dissect this carefully. What Nixon thought was going to happen in 72, when Teddy was really besmirched by the Chappaquiddick problem, he thought Teddy was going to skip the primaries, show up at the convention, and get selected without having to run the gauntlet. So Nixon in the White House is shaking people, saying, don't relax, don't stand down. I've been beaten by these people before. It could have been thought he could do the same thing in 76. It is odd, to your point, Peter, that when he finally did run in 1980, he blew the campaign. Jimmy Carter beat him time after time after time.
I remember so clearly, every single Tuesday during the primaries, I stayed up late at night watching the primary returns.
When you could learn the results. You could learn the results back then. They had paper ballots.
Real elections.
Teddy's announcement was some very, very prominent news anchor. I forget who.
Roger Mudd. Roger Mudd.
Why do you want to be president?
Yeah.
Teddy doesn't know. He screws it up. It's a terrible response. So they give him a do-over. They seat him down with Roger Mudd again to do another take. I mean, you know, you talk about being in love with somebody, and it was all for the restoration of Camelot. I mean, that's what the theory was. So those are the five theories. Given what we know today, given the documents that have come out and what people have said, and what we've learned about the deep state, it's possible each of these conspiracy theories is partially true. Yeah, Nixon had crooks on his staff. Nixon wasn't a crook, but Gordon Liddy was, and Nixon hired him. You know, I mean, I didn't like it. No. Nixon never met him. Haldeman and Ehrlichman never met him. Bud Krogh hired him. My boss hired him to be on our domestic council staff. Against my wishes. It was one of the great mistakes of our nation. The CIA. The CIA is involved in a lot of stuff, and could well have. As I say, I think they knew what was going on, and chose not to become involved.
Just going back to the CIA, because you know the Tucker Carlson. I mean that's how Tucker Carlson said this conversation that took place with Helms. And he talked about this June the 23rd. And I remember the June the 23rd conversation, which is the famous one, the smoking gun conversation. And they were talking about Helms. Nixon was talking to Haldeman about Helms. And he says, we saved Helms from a lot of things. And he said, the Bay of Pigs thing.
Right.
And so that's really a kind of a mystery. What was Nixon talking about? Why is he saying we saved Helms from a lot of things, like the Bay of Pigs things? And that's where I think some people have written, Jefferson Morley included, that what he was really talking about, the Bay of Pigs thing, is that the Kennedy assassination was connected with the Bay of Pigs thing. That's where the CIA may have been involved, because that was revenge for Kennedy betraying the CIA plans in 61.
That is certainly a leg of that conspiracy theory. I'm somewhat familiar with the tape of June 23rd. Called the Smoking Gun Tape. I was the third person to hear it after Nixon and Bizart. I'm the one that transcribed it. I prepared the first transcript of it, and I'm the one that named it the Smoking Gun. And I named it the Smoking Gun because Bizart, my boss, that I was working every day, was just appalled, because it's perfectly clear. Haldeman comes in and says, we don't want the FBI to interview these guys. And what John Dean thinks we ought to do is get the CIA to tell them that they're part of the CIA operation, so don't interview them. And that works for 10 days. Then they do interview them, and they're not involved. These were money people. They were funneling money from donors to the Nixon campaign, and the particular donors in question were very prominent Democrats. So the purpose was to get the CIA to put off the interview of these people, which would disclose prominent Democrats who'd given to Nixon. The connection, Nixon gets enthusiastic. You remember, you're president, Peter. People come in every day and they start describing something, and you don't have the background. You're worried about peace in our time and settling the war. And Haldeman says, look, if we name Bob Jones to be commissioner of the Appalachian Commission, it'll satisfy Harry Byrd on the debt ceiling. I'm making this up. And Nixon says, sounds good to me. It's been staffed. By the time it gets to Haldeman, it should really have been buttoned up. Nixon trusts Haldeman. He's been with him since 1956. So this is not a big decision, but Nixon gets enthusiastic about the CIA. And you have to remember, Hunt, career CIA officer, was the mysterious Eduardo who was liaising with the Cubans who were going to invade Cuba. It was a privately funded army of Cuban emigres in Florida, and the CIA was funding it, and the mysterious Eduardo was the guy they worked with. So fast backward to the plumbers break-in, they get permission to conduct a covert operation to examine the shrink's files, but they tell Hunt and Liddy, you can't do it. You can't be involved. And Hunt says, I got some friends we might want to call on. They're the Cubans that they Shanghai. Same Cubans who later do the Watergate break-in. So the Watergate break-in has occurred six days before. They know Hunt's involved, and they want to put pressure on the CIA. And so he's referring to Hunt's, I believe, it is equally reasonable that he's referring to Hunt's involvement in the funding and training and staging of the Cuban army.
We saved Helms from a lot of things. That's what Nixon's words. We saved Helms from a lot of things. And one of these said is Bay of Pigs. And it's kind of strange. What does Nixon mean? We saved Helms from a lot of things. Because the whole point is that to lean on Helms. They wanted to lean on Helms so that Helms would lean on the FBI. And Nixon says, yeah, Helms should do this for us because we saved Helms from a lot of things.
Well, you could also believe he's saying we didn't disclose more about the CIA mess-ups.
Mm.
Go back to the Kennedy assassination. He could say we kept them out of that. I don't think Nixon knew. Nixon wasn't running the Warren Commission. Didn't occur during his presidency. But what you say, this is fun, Peter. I have this fun every day. I'm going back through these tapes word for word.
Okay, I want to ask you about that, but go finish your answer. Go ahead.
Okay. There's an allusion in one conversation to the Steele case. It's not like the Steele case. What the hell are they talking about, Peter? Jack Kennedy sent FBI agents to wake up Steel Company executives to command at midnight to command they roll back their price increases. Remember, my daddy always told me businessmen were sons of bitches, and now I believe it. In 30 years, when a scholar studies the Nixon tapes without my help, he won't have any idea, he or she, won't have any idea what the steel case reference is.
Okay, but this is exactly what I wanted to ask you. I mean, you've kind of, I mean, this is the second time we've talked. You've told us that you transcribed these things. You're one of the most interesting people alive right now. You transcribed them, okay? Because that's the reference point all of us have for good theories, bad theories.
Yeah,
it all goes to you. But I mean, when you were doing it, I know this will be a very difficult question because this is what you live and breathe every single day.
Every day.
But how is when you go back to the time when you were doing it and speed up to the present, how much have you changed your mind or reinterpreted? Because I'm glad you said the steel case, because I was just wondering, if you go through the first draft of it, how much do you really understand what's going on? You've put decades of scholarship into it. Has that changed dramatically?
Hugely. Yeah. This is going to be a 5-minute answer. So I'm associate director to the domestic council. I'm in charge of the law and order issue. The roof is caving in. Bazart's over trying to help. He's brought over by Al Haig. I'm 28 years old. I go down to his office and I say, if you don't mind, I'd like to chat with you for a couple minutes. Why are we screwing up? Why can't we do a better job in defending the president? Seems to me we're not fighting hard enough. And Bazart, who's a very private person, so private in his office, which is huge. It used to be the Secretary of State's office. There's no chair near his desk for visitors to sit. He doesn't want visitors. If you look for a place to sit, it's way over there on the couch on the other side of this giant office. Used to be John Dean's office. It wasn't a pleasant conversation. I go back a couple weeks later. Why can't we do a better job? Thank you for your interest, Geoff. See you around. Then the Saturday Night Massacre occurs. We agree to turn over the tapes, the first 9 subpoenaed tapes. Turns out, I wasn't working for Bazart at the time. Nixon wouldn't let his lawyers listen to the tapes. He said, it's a waste of your time. They'll never be turned over. There are more important things for you to do. So when Charles Allen Wright walks into John Sirica's court on Tuesday morning, October 23rd, and says, we'll turn over the tapes. It was news to everybody. It caused the prosecutors to reevaluate their position, because if Nixon was willing to turn over the tapes, it meant he didn't think he was guilty. And they better look further for real scoundrels. Then they discovered 2 of those subpoenaed conversations were never recorded. Tape ran out, and it was on a phone that wasn't tapped. And then the day before Thanksgiving, this is now November 23rd, 24th, the 18-minute gap bursts on the nation. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving. I'm having guests over, my wife and I, couple that we love and adore. We're going to leave from our Thanksgiving dinner, go to Williamsburg, have the holiday down there. Phone rings, and we're doing a toast. Just sat down to this gorgeous turkey dinner. Phone rings. I thought it was family. I'll get rid of him, be right back. It's Al Haig. Al Haig wants to know what the hell's going on with this gap and where the lawyers are. Nobody seems to be around. This is Thanksgiving Day. It was the first of 4 phone calls from Al Haig that day. I never made it back to the dinner table, and we didn't go to Williamsburg. I showed up at the White House the next day, and my assignment was, we know what caused the 18-minute gap because we have an expert from NSA who came over after dark to Rosewood's office, and he can make the machine buzz, but he can't testify. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to find a tape expert who can recreate the buzz and testify that it's the machine that caused the gap. That's my introduction to
Oh
Buzz's employment.
What was the cause of the gap? What do you think was the cause of the gap?
Well, let's postpone that for a second.
All right.
Okay. So Buzz needs some help with these tapes. Sirica said, you got to turn the tapes over. There's 2 missing in an 18-minute gap. I demand the 4-inch reels now. So they go back to NSA to make copies. Okay. I'm sorry. Sirica said that after the 2 tapes weren't recorded, before the 18-minute gap. This is what Bazart's told me. He goes over with this NSA guy that he knows from the Pentagon, and they make high-speed copies of the 7 subpoenaed tapes, of the whole reel. It's just easier. But it keeps stopping early because it hits the gap and it stops. So that's when he discovers it. And he goes over and he tells Sirica, he tells Jaworski, somebody's been messing with the tapes. There's a gap. We can catch them if you work with me. And Jaworski says, no, we got to tell Sirica. We got to tell Sirica right now. So he and Bazart go over to the court, tell Sirica. Sirica says, oh, this is fantastic. We got to have a hearing this afternoon. I'm calling the hearing for 2 o'clock. Well, the only person that knows there's a gap is Bazart. The prosecutors haven't discovered the gap. They don't have any background. So at the hearing, the way they bring the information out is to put Bazart on the stand and cross-examine him, which creates the impression Bazart caused the gap. And here, Sirica has ruined his ability to catch the culprit, and Bazart is blamed for causing the gap. So he calls me down to his office, new best friend, and says, I have something for you to do. I have something for you to do to help. Here's a tape recorder. Rose Woods has done the first cut on this transcript, but it's very hard to hear and it's very hard to do. You don't know who's in the room, who's talking, all that stuff. And she's just an assistant. You're a lawyer. You can follow the conversation and you may be able to get more out of the transcription than she could. So I've marked, here you go. I'm going to tune you up first tape. Here's the headset. Here's the foot pedal. See you around. So yeah, well, I'm going to sit and wait. And then there's some murmuring in the background. In about 10 minutes of this murmuring, it finally occurs to me, that's the conversation. You can hardly hear the thing. You turn it way up. And then Nixon puts a coffee cup down on the desk, or he puts his feet up on the desk, blows off in your ears. It's sound activated. So if he pauses, it shuts down. If he starts, zoop, and as it comes up to speed. So you miss the first 3 words all the time because it's very sensitive. And you make this, the way Bazart described my job to Woodward later was Geoff verified the transcripts. Rose and a lady named Marge Acker did the first cut. Geoff verified it. Now, I've had people tell me, well, you were supposed to not hear certain things. And I've said, no. Bazart said, we're going to turn these reels over, or they've already been, the original, already been turned over to Sirica. We've got to know what's on those tapes. They're waiting for us to supply a transcript. They don't want to transcribe them. So we got to get through it. But it's got to be accurate. We can't later learn of a surprise. So I strove for accuracy. And then later, April 30th, 74, we published the Blue Book. I sleep with these things under my pillow. This is the Blue Book, which is 1,200 pages of transcripts of about 4 dozen tapes.
There we go. Got it.
I'm not credited with being editor.
How do you feel about that?
Thank you note from the president.
How do you feel about that?
Well, I have a thank you note from the president thanking me for my work on that product. And I am the expletive deleter, you know. So we do these under stress. We're doing them from copies, high-speed copies that are not good audio quality, and we don't have sophisticated sound equipment. So there's a current professor who's an expert on the Nixon tapes. He runs nixontapes.org. And he's produced 2 books. They're up there on the Nixon tapes, not the Watergate tapes, but the Nixon tapes. And he has said, he's been asked about errors, you know, and improvements over time. And he says there are about 10,000 errors in earlier transcriptions. He's not picking on me. He's just being candid. I transcribed them. The FBI brought in assistants, clerical assistants from the Midwest offices who transcribed them. The special prosecutor went over those for introduction in court. The House Judiciary Committee put out transcriptions of 8 of the Dean tapes. The quality is so bad that you're stretching and you hear what you want him to have said. Mm-hmm. Like this thing, I know who shot John, instead of like, who shot John? So there are easily different interpretations. When I did it in the beginning, back in 1973, it was like reading a novel. You didn't know what was going to happen on the next page. You really got into this. I knew everybody. I knew who they were. And if it's a telephone tap, it's perfect. You know who's on it. You hear everything. If it's an Oval Office tape, it's pretty good. He's got lapel mics pushed into his blotter and on the lamp. But he'd go every afternoon to his hideaway office in the old executive office building. And that's where he'd talk with his closest associates. He'd think out loud. He'd throw out ideas. That tape system was terrible. And you just can't hear what they're saying. So it makes it very hard to follow the thread. I told, and we're going through them, I'm going through these every day at 10 o'clock. Okay, if I weren't on this call with you guys, I'd be. And when the minute I hang up, we're going to do the conversation to March 27th. And we're going to start through word for word. And we're going to annotate where we think people need to know who it is. You know, the full name. If he talks about Clark, he doesn't mean Clark McGregor, who headed up congressional relations. He means Clark Molinoff, who was a lawyer on his staff at one point. So we're going to annotate. But I said a day or two ago, after we went through the most critical week, this is when they learned of Hunt's blackmail demand, and on Monday and on Friday, Sirica sentences the people. When we got there on those conversations, I said, you know, I've written essays that draw different conclusions from what we're drawing. I would have sworn that at the time it went a certain way. And as we've gone through it, it doesn't go that way. The conversations. I'll do that and then I'll stop if I could. Well, I'm good. I'm good for you guys.
All right.
I've maintained.
Go ahead.
Okay. From the beginning, from my first transcriptions, that Nixon learns of Hunt's blackmail demand Wednesday morning, 10:30, March 21st, from John Dean. And both Dean and Nixon agree this is the first time he told him any specifics about the cover-up. That he says, the reason I've asked for this is there's a cancer within the presidency. It's nearby, it's growing, it's mutating. It gets worse. You're going to have to make some decisions, and you don't know what's been going on. People have been perjuring themselves. It's going to get worse. They're going to have to make tough choices, and we're being blackmailed. And then an hour and a half, they go through this. and the prosecution in secret maintained to the grand jury and to the House Judiciary Committee that Nixon learns about the blackmail demand from John Dean. The meeting ends at noon. It's a fact that at 10 o'clock that night, part of the blackmail was paid to Hunt's lawyer. So you got a 10-hour gap, but what must have happened is after Dean left the room, because he doesn't approve it, it's on tape. He learns from Dean. Nixon must have told Haldeman to call Mitchell, tell Mitchell to authorize the payment, and the payment should be made by what we'll call the paymaster, a lesser known individual who delivered the cash. And that cash payment was made at 10 o'clock. It's open and shut. That's what must have happened. We didn't know that was the accusation. We really thought the payment was made earlier in the week, so it really never even came up. But now we know it really was made at 10 o'clock that night. But I maintain, because they're kicking around how they're going to deal with Hunt's threat to disclose the plumber's break-in. Plumber's break-in is authorized at the highest levels within the White House. This isn't some campaign excess across the street. The plumber's thing, directed by Liddy and Hunt, authorized by Krogh, approved by John Ehrlichman, perhaps known to the president. So how are we going to respond to Hunt's threat to disclose this if we don't pay him? And I believed that in a second meeting that day and in a follow-up meeting the next day with John Mitchell, that Nixon had come to the conclusion the only way to beat Hunt was not to pay him, because that would never end, but to disclose Hunt's illegal activities themselves. You got to be careful how it comes out. You got to, little English on the ball. But if we disclose it, he can't blackmail us. Well, I just got through spending a week and a half, word for word, 3 or 4 conversations, and that isn't as clear to me today as it was back then. So one of the things I need to do, get that trusty blue book out, compare it to a more modern transcription, and see if my memory is faulty, which of course it couldn't be, or if the transcription has really changed that much. See, what they bad about, I'm sorry to go on, this is all I do.
Right, but just on that point, Nixon did reveal at some point, I can't remember what month it was, about the plumbers unit. I mean, that was one of the kind of limited hangout. The White House issued a statement at some point and explained the origins of the plumbers unit, what they were trying to do, even though, obviously denied that Nixon had any part in the Watergate break-in, but he did issue that statement about the plumbers unit.
That phrase, it's a hangout, it's a limited hangout. Modified limited hangout, is in the conversation I just reviewed yesterday. So that's in the forefront of my mind, but that's not where they explained to Nixon what the plumbers did. That's not picked up. We don't have a tape. Now, it could be that part was exercised, removed, because there were national security implications. We don't get the full tapes. When the tapes are turned over to Sirica, Sirica said, I will hear the tape first. You prepare a transcript for me. And I will remove national security items and any claims of executive privilege before it gets to the prosecutors. So those issues will have been resolved. So you'll hit on the tape every once in a while, there's a 10-second omission. There's a 5-minute omission. There's a backup tape. So every once in a while, a tape will run out and the new tape won't start except for 5 more minutes, and you put in little stars. We're going to go back and see if that stuff has subsequently been released. We just don't know. But your main point, that Nixon knew they were at risk because of the plumber's break-in. And he kept telling Peterson, don't go there. That's national security. In running the cover-up, desk officer for the cover-up, Dean doesn't tell his superiors that they're paying these guys off, or that he's rehearsing them for their perjured testimony, or that he's destroyed evidence taken from unsafe, or that he's stolen money to pay for his honeymoon. He's describing the problems the other people have, never himself. And the original career prosecutors in their summation memo said, we didn't give Dean immunity because he was never forthcoming about his own role. And we figured that out. So we said, no.
So Watergate was all about John Dean's deceit. That's what it was all about. That was the whole thing.
Well, Archibald Cox is quoted in the book by the prosecutors is saying, at the end of the day, after the national security, all the doubts, everything else, the one thing I can cling to is John Dean's venality. He recruited, and that's the end of the quote. He recruits Liddy. He's in the meetings in the AG's office where this crazy plan is described. His own employee is passing out the money. He tells his superiors, we don't dare give an inch because they'll learn about the plumbers. And the plumbers are major risk, not this. And then when he switches sides, when he decides, I've gotten us in so deep, I need a ladder to get out of this hole, he goes and discloses to them the plumbers. And the prosecutors are very upset. This is illegal. But it doesn't get Dean off. So they refuse. His immunity came from the Irvin Committee, not from the career prosecutors. But back to Nixon. Nixon concludes, we've got to disclose what happened with the plumbers. Now, in today's review, it's all over these statements that we need to put, Dean has to prepare a report, and we need to put the report out, share it privately with Senator Irvin, give it to the grand jury. They aren't quite sure how to do it. But right after the break-in, Dean goes for the walk with Gordon Liddy. He says, Gordon, I got to know, did anybody on the White House staff know? Gordon says, no, totally. White House staff is clean. Dean reports this to his superiors. He's asked to conduct an inquiry. He does. And he comes back and he tells them, because they thought it was Colson. I mean, Colson's crazy enough to do anything. He comes back and he says, no one on your staff, knew about the planned break-in. And the White House built its entire defense about that. There may be trouble at Creep. We don't want to make it any worse for them. There may be layers of who knew. But we can stake our presidency on the fact nobody here knew. And even as late as March 17th, and the 21st, members, when Dean finally tells him what's been going on by others, even on March 17th, Nixon is begging him to prepare a statement, they call it the Dean Report, that will clear members of the White House staff. This has been said, this is not true. Ehrlichman has been accused of, this is not true. There's no reason for the grand jury to call Ehrlichman or Haldeman because they're not involved. And there's no reason for the Irvin Committee to call members of the White House because I've conducted an inquiry and they are clean. Now, John, when you write this, you don't have to necessarily dump on anybody over at Creep. And John has been telling them all along, we don't dare disclose because we'll undercut the defense already put forth by people at Creep. And remember, it goes up pretty high at Creep. They're positive Magruder has they're positive that John Dean has told them that Magruder has perjured himself. John doesn't say that he rehearsed Magruder for that testimony. So they don't know how John knows it, but he knows it. And they're really worried about Mitchell.
Yeah.
So they call Mitchell down to figure out what to do, but the undercurrent of the meeting, when Mitchell's finally there, is if we put out this Dean statement and call for a renewed investigation, new facts have come to my attention. Basically, John Dean, what I want you to do, you told me stuff yesterday, Wednesday, in that speech that I knew nothing about. I want you to reduce it to writing, and I will use that as the basis for calling for a renewed investigation. Now, what's not said is they're pretty certain that that new investigation will sink John Mitchell, and that by calling for a new investigation, they're really throwing the president's best friend under the bus. And they're talking about this without saying that, because he's in the room. I go way back to the break-in.
So, I mean, Geoff, this is so much of this is so fascinating. You know, we could go on for several more hours, but the March 21st anniversary, the 50-year anniversary is coming up, and I think we should resume and discuss this on March the 21st, of the 50-year anniversary of that damning conversation.
Well, I think that's a great idea, and I think maybe at the core of it is that what are the mistaken perceptions 50 years on?
Yeah.
Okay, because I think that's really important. I mean, the Tucker Carlson monologue I found really fascinating. I couldn't catch all the errors like you could.
Right. Well, but that's and again,
but I mean, it's very interesting is the precarious state of the presidency. If you're liked by the establishment, you're liked by the intel community, you can pretty much do anything. If you're not liked and you don't have friends, they can easily destroy you.
Yeah.
Yes, and
that's
if
right.
you already have power, it's surprising what you will do to hang on to it. Just for your viewers' knowledge, remember that Watergate is unfolding over this next 2 years. Today, January 27th, we're in the middle of the burglar trial before Judge Sirica. They will be found guilty on the 30th.
You know, Geoff, I know maybe it's a little too late, but some of my colleagues, they did the Russian Revolution. So they started in 2015, and they were building up to it, and they had a Twitter account, and they did history exactly 100 years ago.
Oh wow!
I want to think something like that, because
that's a good idea.
Subscribe to it. I think it would be fascinating.
50 years exactly. Yeah,
I have 100-page detailed chronology.
Well, what you could do is with the break-in and go for over the next 2 years.
Absolutely.
And just say on this day here, this person talked to this person. I think it would be an eye opener. I think so many people that don't, we get the word fill in the blank gate. You have to flesh it out for everyone. Why this has turned into a seminal event? Why it's been so misperceived, used, and abused. I think you should seriously think about that. Yeah. Watergate 50 years on, day by day, blow by blow.
No, that's a great idea.
Take your suggestion under advisement.
Anyway, Geoff, thanks very much, and we will resume because there's so much to discuss. Exactly in March. And thanks a lot. Thank you very much. And remember, if you like the Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.